Finance Minister Arun Jaitley is in fact speaking at the CII. Let's listen in.
The cumulative effect of these steps. I think India, which had fallen off the global radar in the last 2 to 3 years, people have again started looking at us. There is a considerable amount of buzz about India. People are watching very carefully. They are now beginning to get convinced that India would be once again a place to invest in. Those within India who were now looking outside are probably reconsidering their decision. And therefore, I think the Indian system, and that merely doesn't include the central government, it includes the state governments, it includes all of us collectively, because we are living in a country which is administered on the principle of cooperative federalism. We all collectively continue to pursue one positive direction. And it's only then over the next few months and the initial years, I think the effects within the country will also start showing.
Minister, when we look at all those reforms from a rational point of view, I think they are in good hands with the Prime Minister and you as the principal architect. But usually when you have to reform whatever it is, you have to take into account the mindset, and the biggest hurdle is the mindset of the people. And of course also in the case of India, as I hear, the systemic failure very often caused by crony corruption. What is your feeling about it? How can you change? I mean, someone told me if you would do a poll among all the people working for the government, you probably would have 10% very supportive, 30% somewhere in between, and 60% opposed. So how can you change this mindset, and how can you create a corruption-free society?
I think those who administer India have first to change their mindset. And if we change our mindset, which we are attempting to, the last 5 to 6 months, every decision which we have consistently pursued has also been intended in the direction of eliminating any possible discretion. Now let's look at the areas where charges of crony capitalism have come about in recent years. Allocation of natural resources. Now somehow we pursued a policy which actually did say that there is a huge element of discretion the government has. Once those discretions were misused, and misused for collateral reasons, you perhaps had those allegations of crony capitalism. Some of them were actually true. The spectrum allocation, the coal block allocation, and these became defining moments against India. They became defining moments and put a question mark on our entire intention to honestly pursue reforms in the economy. If there is freedom from controls, there has to be an element of fairness within the system, which appeared to be lacking. Now look at the way we've taken some of our decisions. The whole mess on the coal blocks, we've almost surgically come out with a new law through an ordinance, which was an emergency law in India, which has very clearly 3 or 4 aspects. There are a large number of state sector companies both at the center and the regions. So they get the first allotment of coal blocks. The actual users get it by a process of e-auction. And thereafter, if the government desires, it will open it up for commercial mining. I can tell you, with regard to other minerals, we are about to undertake a similar reform. The element of discretion in the hands of the state has almost disappeared. And therefore, once you take decisions of this kind, and governments change their mindset, eliminate the possibility of any corruption, collateral consideration, or crony capitalism as you call it, obviously there is going to be a much larger support for a reform of this kind. And therefore investors also are certainly going to be looking for a system which is fair, not a system on which they have to entirely depend on the largesse of politicians and ministers.
Yeah. Just to follow up the issue of mindset, your government is very results oriented. It's very impressive how you put results into the center. But can you go as far as to make every state employee in every village really evaluated on the basis of the results he delivers?
Welcome back. We take you straight back to the CII, where Union Finance Minister is addressing the World Economic Forum.
I had seriously discussed it. So one of my first decisions was to make it 49%. And then it was accompanied by a great debate that how it helps the interests of Indian society. And by and large, I thought it's been welcome, and I can almost see the first ripple effects of this almost beginning to happen. I do hope that India will, and the private sector in India now, along with their joint venture partners, would manufacturing of the defense equipment in India in a reasonably big manner. That's the initial indications.
Minister, one of the other obstacles which is always mentioned is the infrastructure and infrastructure development. And I will ask you later a question about international trade, but some people would say India has to address the issue of its internal trade, which is blocked by a lack of infrastructure. Now there is a discussion also going on in the G20 how to finance long-term infrastructure projects. India needs a big effort in this respect. How do you want to undertake it, and how do you want to finance it?
Well, in infrastructure, let me tell you, we welcome large investment participation, even international participation. And that is one area on which there is a much broader consensus in India. Of late, there have been financing issues. And there have been financing issues even in sectors which were earlier doing well. For instance, our national highways program, our ports program, which had been going on quite well. I think of late I've seen some financing issues. We are dealing with our own domestic financial sector, the banking sector, and trying to resolve some of those issues so that the financing of infrastructure can begin in a big way. But even international participation in this sector is something which we completely welcome. And for instance, our railways was almost close to private sector investment, let alone foreign investment. We've already taken our decision to open up our railways, at least some parts of our railways, for that investment. And if the initial experiments do succeed, it will probably enable us to open a lot more. In real estate, and we need housing in a big way. Almost 60 to 65% of the people in India don't have a home. or a regular proper home. Some have homes in their villages. And therefore we need urbanization in a big way. We need suburbanization in a big way. This process had started. Now the last government has left some hurdles behind. And this is again another sector which we've opened up for foreign investment. Because this is where capital has to come in large numbers. Earlier investment, because of the restrictive norms, was confined only to the major metros. We've now liberalized those norms so that we can reach the tier 2, tier 3 cities also.
Now, Minister, I would commend you on all those actions, because what I see in the international community, India is now at the top of the, I would say, attention list of the investors community.
Thank you.
So to make sure that this interest is as fast as possible translated into action, I think requires the necessary frameworks. And here I just would like to refer to what you said at the very beginning. You have to undo certain laws, and one of those laws, as far as I understand, is the land, how do you call it, land law?
Acquisition law.
Land acquisition law. And I know there are many aspects, like you are not allowed to open private schools, private hospitals, and so on. What importance do you give to this land acquisition law, and what will you do about it?
Well, that's one of the more difficult areas. You see, first let me tell you, there's something, at least one good aspect of that law also. And that one good aspect of the law is that a lot of land-owning farmers in India, and these were subsistence farmers, when their land is acquired and they got a one-time compensation, by and large, even by Indian standards, the compensations were inadequate. And therefore this law flagged an issue of increasing quantums of compensation. It also flagged the issue of long-term relief and rehabilitation of those people. I have absolutely no quarrel with that part of the law, and I think that part of the law must remain. The one which poses a difficult challenge is that procedurally the law lays down a very complicated procedure for acquisition of land. Now, conceptually, acquisition of land was always a sovereign power. It was a sovereign right, or eminent domain as they called it. Because in any society, from building a defense cantonment or an installation, to building a school, to building a highway, to building a graveyard, for anything you needed land. And therefore, if acquisition of land was made complicated, almost impossible, then the growth process itself gets stalled. And this law has made it extremely complicated. Now, the previous government thought that perhaps this law, because it makes it very complicated with a section of the population, would be extremely popular, and it could be a vote-fetching device. Now, that doesn't seem to have happened. Now that that conclusion has been established, I think time has come, at least at the second part of this law, to have a relook. And there are areas, once you get functioning, I today in the newspapers read a statement of one of the state government ministers belonging to the Congress party in one of the states, who said the difficulties they are facing. I can tell you, as the defense minister, I am facing a difficulty every day where even defense and national security is not an exempted purpose. So you have to go through, for a regular acquisition, that complicated process. Today, rural infrastructure, urban infrastructure, industrial corridors, industrial parks, affordable housing, housing for the poor. Now, even for these purposes for which land is required, and these are essential purposes, you don't get land. And then there are some illogical provisions like the one you mentioned, that land cannot be used or acquired under this law for private educational institutions or private hospitals. So if Andhra Pradesh is today going to set up a new capital, he'll have to first make sure in the land it acquires that there is no school or hospital in it. Because the moment they did it, I think the gentleman who drafted this must be asked to explain the rationale behind a provision of this kind. So if we are planning to set up 100 smart cities, they have to be without a private hospital or a private school or a private university. Or even a hotel, because it says it bars three purposes: private educational institutions, private hospitals and hotels. There are some factors in it which I think certainly require a relook.
Minister, I would like to ask you a more international question. India accounts for 23% of global population, but only 2% of global trade. Now, India should have a special interest in facilitating global trade relations. Now, coming from Geneva and looking at the WTO negotiations, India is put on the let's say, is accused of being a stumbling block, as you know. And one of the parts in the present negotiation is trade facilitation. And we, the Forum, published a report, and I think you were 93rd country in terms of trade facilitations. Would you express your own opinion? How can India? What is the reason which holds India back to come?
Well, India is certainly not opposed to trade facilitation. Let me make it clear.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, even if there was no WTO, for our own reasons, we would be facilitating trade and having therefore the best infrastructure for that. Mm-hmm. Now, our trade facilitation commitment is not because of any multilateral arrangement at the WTO. Mm-hmm. It's a commitment as a developing economy which we owe to ourselves, and therefore we are going to have trade facilitation. Now, India's position on trade facilitation has been completely misunderstood because of an unreasonable positioning by some of the developed countries. And that unreasonable positioning is the following. As a part of the Bali arrangement, what is sought to be pushed through is trade facilitation, one, and two, a permanent solution being found to stock holdings in agriculture and food grain. Now, India has a very large food procurement program where a state agency procures food from the farmers. Today's newspaper headlines tell us how the international prices have fallen. And if food grain prices collapse, and India is not able to subsidize its farmers to that extent. Now, most of the subsidies as far as the United States and the European Union are concerned, from the amber box and the blue box have moved to the green box now. The quantum has increased, it hasn't come down. Now, obviously, therefore, the state has to buy the food grain from the farmers, and that food grain as a part of our food program, we have a legislative support to that food program, is now distributed to poor people in India. That's our food program. Now, there is sought to be a permanent arrangement on restricting the extent of food stock holdings, which, if it is reduced, would result in Indian government not being able to buy from its own farmers and food grain from elsewhere coming in, increasing the number of suicides which our farmers in India are being compelled because of indebtedness to commit. Therefore, Indian state, Indian government owes it to its farmers to protect their interests. Now, we are negotiating the food stock holdings arrangement, which is sought to be calculated on the prices of 1987, 86, 87, which itself appears to be unreasonable. But then the controversy is only about one clause, and that one clause is we agree to trade facilitation. The arrangement on food stock holdings is arrived at. It may take a much longer time to arrive at that arrangement, but the peace clause and the impact of the peace clause in simple language is that if India doesn't restrict its food stock holdings, it will be taken to the dispute mechanism at the WTO. The peace clause would vanish in 4 years. Now, all that we have requested is the settlement of the dispute with regard to the food stock holding and the peace clause must continue to coexist.
Union Finance Minister Arun Jaitley is still speaking at the World Economic Forum in the national capital. Let's listen.
Something which we've already discussed. Some of them have been introduced in Parliament, are due for discussion in Parliament in one of the forthcoming sessions. And this is an area where we will have to have much larger consideration, even with people working in that sector. And currently, I think that it's about time that process started. But will that happen immediately? I'm unable to say that as far as the passage is concerned, because some people will certainly have reservations on that issue. Will I be able to immediately get it passed in Parliament? I'm not in a position to comment. I see merit in your suggestion, but then there are many others within the political system who still don't see merit in that suggestion itself. So we have to convince all of them that perhaps a more flexible policy will create more jobs and is more labor friendly. But that's a process in which I think a much larger debate in India is required.
But you foresee this process taking place and hopefully coming to a positive end still during this legislature?
No, this requires a legislative change, and therefore we have to prepare our legislature for a change of this kind.
But still in the coming, I mean, under the present government, before the next elections, let's put it in this.
I am unable to bind myself to any time, but there are changes which are more reasonably plausible, as I said. Yeah. 3 of those changes, our government has already decided, the cabinet has passed them, some of them are already before the Parliament, and they are being discussed.
Now, the last question, Minister, I ask you in your capacity as Minister of Defense. I think the world welcomed the opening up of relations with Pakistan. Now there have been some incidents lately. You made some comments. How do you see the evolution of your relationship with your closest neighbor, if I may say so, or most important neighbor, Pakistan?
Well, it's a very important question that you've asked. The answer to that really, it depends on how Pakistan chooses to answer that question. You see, the present government sent a clear signal in the first instance that we were willing to speak to Pakistan. We were willing to normalize a relationship with Pakistan. We invited the head of government, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, to India at the swearing in of the government itself, which was a very important signal. The 2 prime ministers met, they discussed. It's never the government of India's stand that we are not going to speak to Pakistan. But at what level you speak and when do you speak, the environment for that dialogue and the level at which the dialogue takes place has to be entirely set by Pakistan. But then there are a few red lines. So we invite them, we create the environment, we then fix up a dialogue at the level of the foreign secretaries. Our foreign secretary is to visit Pakistan. Literally a few hours before that, they invite the separatists for a dialogue to their High Commission. So I think a new red line had to be drawn in Pakistan to reconsider this question. that who do they want to speak to? They want to speak to the government of India, or do they want to speak to those who want to break India? So unless Pakistan makes that conscious choice, a meaningful dialogue with Pakistan would not be possible. And then came the third stage, where hostilities are mounted at the international border and the line of control. Now, traditionally, when such hostilities are mounted, we've been defending ourselves. But we did consider, and that's the statement I made, that Pakistan also must realize that this kind of a misadventure, where you fire on civilian population, start killing civilian population, uproot Indian villages at the line of control of the international border, probably the consequences of all this would be an unaffordable cost for Pakistan. And therefore, each one of our three actions so far has a message. The first is we want to talk. So we invited them. The second is we send our foreign secretary there. But then you must decide whether to speak to our foreign secretary or to speak to those who want to break India. And the third is that this kind of a situation on the Indian international border can't go on. That there is a daily tension. That's not an environment for a dialogue. And therefore, India would like to normalize the relationship. But whether Pakistan wants to normalize the relationship, it depends on Pakistan. Now, I can quite understand Pakistan's problem is who decides these things in Pakistan, the civilian government or somebody else?
Minister, I think this session, which in half an hour, you gave a precise answer to so many questions. I think it just shows the new tone and the new mode of the government, of the country. It's based on efficiency. It's based on a comprehensive policy. I quote you, you said reforms are the art of the possible.